We can talk about that later. If you don't know me or you're wondering who I was on the screen, my name's Robin. I'm the lead pastor here at Lift. And can we just appreciate, where's Mel? Is Mel in the house somewhere? Hi, Mel. Can we just appreciate Mel? Come on. You may not know this, but our family as a church is doing a tremendous job caring for and serving our cities. And it's not just showing up and doing some do-goodism. The work that we've committed to and the work that Mel is leading is sacrificial, it's painful, it's time-consuming, and it is long-term investments. When we show up and we start something, we don't show up with short-term gains in mind. We're committed to serving people, not because it's in our benefit, but because Jesus has commanded us to. And I truly believe as a church, as we continue to see new locations birthed, what that enables us to do is serve and bring Jesus, not just to campuses, but to some of the most vulnerable people in our nation. And the beautiful thing is that that's not just some idea in my head or in a couple people's heads, but that is something being realized. It's made real. It's being brought into reality because of Mel and her team. You know, it's easy to talk about serving. It's easy to talk about how the church is supposed to help hurt and alleviate things and serve vulnerable people, but it is really difficult to actually do it. And it's really difficult to actually do it for the long term. And Mel, thank you for leading the charge. I don't think people have a clue what you have sacrificed. And you would never share it. You would never, tout your horn. So I'm going to do it for you. Thank you. You're not just a testament of what a Jesus follower can look like. You're a testament of what missional, sacrificial living with Jesus at the center looks like. And so thank you. We appreciate you as a family. And I can't wait to see what the next couple of years bring as we continue to serve not just Hamilton and St. Catharines, but Guelph and the places we're going to be going from there. Can we just thank Mel one more time? Awesome. All right, well, back in November, we sort of tweaked our core guiding vision statement as a church to be, we exist to see people made fully alive in the hope of Jesus by being the church on every campus. And for the last 4 months, we have been leaning into that statement, fully alive. Everybody say fully alive. And we worked our way through the letter to the Colossians. And 2 weeks ago, we finished that letter up, having spent 4 months asking the question, what does it look like to be people made fully alive in the hope of Jesus? How do we live? How do we think? How do we behave? How do we relate? How do we spend our money? How do we build relationships? How do we structure our lives as people fully alive? And it was quite the journey. But today, we are switching gears. We're beginning a new study through the scriptures for the next 4 months as we wind our way through the summer. The first thing we did back in November was we tweaked our vision statement to be, we exist to see people fully alive. But then a couple months later, we introduced the sort of second companion piece to that, which was an adjusted statement around what our core value is. And if you were at the All Teams in January, that was when we sort of unveiled it to everybody for the first time. This is why All Teams is important, because we typically share pretty big things, structural things. And so Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday this week is a key time for that. But that core value statement is very simple, and you'd have to struggle to be around Lift Church for more than a few minutes before you hear somebody mentioning some version of it. And that value statement is everyone sent to multiply everything. In everything we do, we want to see every person that we are engaging with sent on mission for the purposes of God, so that they can in turn see other people sent on mission for Jesus' glory. But that statement is so loaded, it's so packed with an idea that is transformative, that we wanted to take the entire summer to unpack it, systematically demonstrating how it actually wasn't our idea, it was actually God's idea, and it is woven from start to finish in the scriptures. And so for the next 4 months, we are going to be working our way through from Genesis all the way through to the end of the New Testament, exploring this theme of everyone sent to multiply everything. If it's going to be the core driving value of how we think and act and function as a church, then we need to collectively understand what it means. Everyone's sent to multiply everything. The other name we have for this, which you will hear on the podcast or in sort of some of our discipleship material, is the apostolic imperative. Everybody say apostolic imperative. It's like, I don't know, it's just like a good meaty phrase. Apostolic imperative. Apostolic means sent, and imperative means you have to do it. So what we mean by that is that there's this imperative to our church that we exist to send people to multiply for the name of Jesus. Church, we can't be a church of buzzwords. We have to be a church that understands deep in our souls what it means to be multiplying followers of Jesus. That can't just be a phrase. We have to live it. And so that's why we want to unpack it from Genesis through the New Testament over the next couple of months. Looking at different characters that lived this value or demonstrate this value or show how God was weaving it through the story of the Bible. And so today we're going to start at the center of where it kind of all began. A guy named Abraham. We're going to read Abraham's story today, and I want to encourage you. If you've been in church for a while, you're going to think like, I know the Abraham story, and I want to invite you to say maybe that there's actually something deeper going on in these stories. It's so easy to read them and glaze over like, oh, I've heard it. I want to challenge you. I don't know that you've heard it quite like you're going to hear it tonight. I think that there's some depth in these texts that we can mine that is going to help us see how beautiful Jesus is. For those of you that are not Jesus followers and you're like, I don't know anything about the Bible, this is a great series for you. The Bible is divided into two parts: the Old Testament, everything before Jesus, and the New Testament, everything after Jesus. But whether it's before Jesus or whether it's after Jesus, it's all about Jesus. And so what you're going to hear today are some very old stories, a very old narrative about a guy named Abraham, but it's actually a story about Jesus, as you will see. So with all of that context kind of laid, the rationale for where we're going, can we just take a moment and pray before we read the scriptures this afternoon? Jesus, we thank you that when we sing, you are good. It's so true. Jesus, we thank you that your goodness is such that it invites us in. And it doesn't invite us in to be static. It invites us in to join you, to be a part of what you're doing. And so, Lord, I pray that as we open this text up, as we read your word today, God, that you would challenge us. Challenge our thinking about who we are in you and what it means to be a follower of you. Jesus, I pray that you would help me to communicate with humility, grace, but also truth and conviction. Jesus, that our hearts would receive your word today. Amen. Amen. So we're going to start in Genesis chapter 12. And it's going to be a bit of a read, if that's okay. You guys can track along with me. Genesis 12, we're going to start in verse 1. If you can see it on the screens, tap your neighbor on the shoulder and say, can you see it as well? If you didn't tap someone or they didn't tap you, you should both get your eyes checked. I need one of those like lapel mics, so that, anyway, my hand's here. I'm struggling. I'm going to go to my paper because it's too early in the Bible, so it's wanting to close on me. We're way at the beginning. Okay, here we go. Genesis chapter 12, starting in verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, go out. Abram becomes Abraham, so if you're confused, Abram and Abraham, same thing. The Lord said to Abram, go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to find the land that I will. Everybody say, I will show you. I will, everybody say, I will make you into a great nation. I will, everybody say, I will bless you. I will, everybody say, I will. Somebody's catching on. Make your name great, and you will. Everybody say, you will be a blessing. I will. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse anyone who treats you with contempt. And all the persons of the earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went, having received this command from the Lord. Abram went as the Lord told him, and Lot went with him. He was a family member. Abram was 75 years old. That's older than anyone in the room, I'm betting, when he left Haran. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan. When they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the site of Shechem at the oak of Moreh. At that time, the Canaanites were in the land. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your offspring I will give this land. So he built an altar there to the Lord who appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country east of Bethel and pitched his tent. With Bethel on the west and Ai on the east, he built an altar to the Lord there, and he called on the name of the Lord. Then Abram journeyed by stages to the Negev. But then things are about to change. Verse 10, the narrative is about to shift gears a little bit. Then there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to stay there for a while because the famine in the land was severe. He was about to enter Egypt, and he said to his wife Sarai, look, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife. They will kill me, but let you live. Please say that you're my sister so that it will go well for me because of you, and my life will be spared on your account. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh. So the woman was taken into Pharaoh's household. He treated Abram well because of her, and Abram acquired flocks and herds, male and female donkeys, and male and female slaves and camels. But the Lord, verse 17, struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife Sarai. So Pharaoh sent for Abram and said, what have you done to me? Why didn't you tell me she was your wife? Why did you say she's my sister? So that I took her as my wife. Now here is your wife. Take her and go. Then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife and all he had. So it's like kind of this fascinating story. It starts off really well. Abram gets this promise from God, and he's going to go change the world, and the whole world is going to be blessed by him. And then just a few verses later, there's a famine. He prostitutes his wife. It's just generally a disaster. This great person of the faith starts off so well. He begins journeying, following the Lord, but then the back half of the narrative changes. What we're going to discover as we study this text, I want to kind of spill the beans up front and then demonstrate it and walk us through it together, is a few things. Number one, that God's character is unchanging. God never changes. His promises, they stand, they are firm, they are trustworthy. Number two, God always moves through people. God doesn't just act in creation, he almost always acts in creation through people. And not just people, very broken and messed up people. And number three, that the call to be sent as Abram was sent echoes from history to us today. The same call that was made to Abram back then is applying to us today. So how are we going to do that? What are we going to look like? What are we going to look at to get there? I want to begin with verse 1. Then the Lord said to Abram, go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house to the land that I will, everybody say, I will show you. There's a few things that Abraham does right in this story. God comes with this promise. He says, I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to show you something that you haven't seen yet, but I need you to trust me. If we're called to live, everyone's sent to multiply everything, one of the very first markers that I see in people that live this characteristic is that they are a people of faith. Abram had not seen the land that God was going to bring him to. He didn't know what God was going to do. In fact, God says, I'm going to show it to you. I'm not going to show it to you right now. I'm going to show it to you later. I need you to trust me. It was a step of faith for Abraham to enter into this new land. It was a step of faith because he didn't know exactly what the outcome was going to be. You know, it's so funny. Alex and I didn't talk about the way he was going to lead pre-service prayer, but I thought it was so brilliant that he was calling us to be a people that walk by faith. By faith. By faith we walk. To be a people of faith doesn't mean that we're a people that are intentionally irrational. To be a people of faith means that we are a people that choose to believe God's promises in things that we haven't yet seen. We choose to have hope in that which we have not yet actually seen. You know, it's so much easier to just live according to what we know, essentially trusting our ability, our plans, our decisions, what we can predict. But if we're going to be a people that are going to live as sent people, it means that we're going to have to live as people stepping into that which we do not know. We are going to have to live and yet we do not yet see. Not trusting only what we see. You may be going, yeah, that sounds like what we're supposed to do as Christians. I want to try and drive this home really critically for us as a Lift Church family for a second. Well, we have spoken about what we're trying to do as a church, seeing a discipleship movement birthed on the campuses of our entire nation. Church, that is a not yet vision. We haven't yet seen it. We don't know how God is going to do it. But we choose to believe that when we surrender our lives and collectively surrender the purposes of this church to Jesus, that Jesus can use this church to see people that are far from God, lost in their sin, dead where they find themselves, made fully alive in Jesus. When we speak of a discipleship movement, that is not something that we can design with great strategy, although we do strategically think. It's not something that we can sit and say, here's the perfect plan. It is a faith vision. We choose to, as a church, believe in faith that as we surrender our lives, not just me, but all of us collectively, to the things of Jesus, that Jesus can actually do more than we can. In other words, we choose to believe by faith that what God has kind of revealed little glimpses to us as a church of what could be. New campuses, people that don't know Jesus coming to know Jesus, churches thriving where there shouldn't be churches, people coming to know Jesus who would never have any access to him, that little glimpse of a vision, we choose to believe by faith that can come to be. To be people that are sent means that we choose to believe God's promises that he is going to build his church and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. We choose to believe him. We choose to take Jesus at his word. That what he has revealed, that what he has shown us, that what he has promised will stand, even though we don't know exactly what it will look like. Church, do you have eyes of faith for what we're collectively doing? Do you have eyes of faith for what your simple church could do? Do you have eyes of faith for what your life could be? Have you actually prayed and said, God, show me, give me a vision just slightly bigger than what I have now according to what you would do? I will show you. I will. He didn't yet reveal it. He just gave him enough of an invitation that Abram took a step. Church, if we're going to be people where everyone is sent to multiply everything, we have to be a people that lead with bold, passionate, audacious faith. What's the thing that God's called you to that you can't do on your own? What do you actually have faith for in your walk with Jesus? What do you actually have faith for in what we're doing as a church? Have you prayed and said, Jesus, expand my horizons, show me just a little bit bigger of a picture? I will show you. The Lord said to Abraham, go. Go from this place and I will show you. Abraham had to first step with faith before God revealed the rest of the story. Now there's a set of promises that God makes to Abram. He says this, he says, I will make you, everybody say, I will. And then he says, I will bless, I will make your name great. He then promises to protect Abram. There's the sequence of I will, I will, I will, I will, I will, and I will. Who is the person that is going to bring the promises given to Abram to pass? When you look at that faith thing, that thing that God is putting in your heart or putting over this church as a whole, who is the one that ultimately brings it to pass in this story? Is it Abraham? No. In fact, Abram does absolutely nothing in this story other than take the next step. God says, I will make your name great. I will bless. I will make you a great nation. God promises to move in Abraham's life. What does this mean for us? Abraham lived as somebody that was going to be a blessing because he had first received the blessing. He understood, or rather, I don't know if he understood it, certainly God made it abundantly clear to him that what he was going to do through Abraham wasn't going to be because of how great Abraham was. It was going to be because of how great God was. Church, if we're going to actually do what we're saying we're going to do as a church, if we're going to actually see thousands of people come to know Jesus, it's not because we're great. It's not because we're smart. It's certainly not because we have great preaching. It's definitely not because I'm supposed to be at the end of that list. It was sort of a pejorative thing, you know? And I've run out of things and I'm going to offend someone. It's not because of who we are, it's because of who God is. God's desire to bless people and use people is because He is good and He will make it happen, not because we are great. Church, if we're going to live as everyone's sent to multiply everything, we have to understand that that is not something that is done in our strength. It is a gift given to us by God. He gives and calls us and invites us to participate with Him. It says this, I will make you a great nation. I will make you a great nation. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. What Abraham gets to do is he and his family, they get to be a blessing to others. In receiving by faith the call of God on their life, they are given a gift, greatness in this case. But it's not for them. It's so that they can be a blessing to others. So, to put it really clearly, Abraham is blessed so that he can bless. At no point in this story does anything that Abraham has done earn him any credit. It's entirely God's goodness and His character. His desire to see people brought into relationship with Him. What this means, church, is that when we speak of being a blessed people, when we speak of receiving the things of God, it's never, ever, under any situation about you or about me. It's always about how good Jesus is. How many of us, when we come and we think about church, we think about it as, what can I receive? What can I get? Church, it's not about you. If you know Jesus, you have already received the blessing of new life in Him. Your job now is to go and be a blessing. The job of the church isn't to coddle, it's to equip the saints so that they can be sent out to be blessings to others. Do you see this for a moment? That God blesses Abraham. He says, I'm going to make you great, but Abraham, you have to understand, this isn't about you. It's so that you can be a blessing to others. God's desire was always to see the nations brought back to a relationship with him. This is foundational. To be sent people means that we are sent with ambitions that are totally other-centric. Our desires, our hopes, and our dreams are not for ourselves. They're so that we can be sent as blessings into the world. We live in such a, if I'm honest for a moment, self-obsessed culture where we love talking about ourselves. We love putting ourselves forward. But as sent people, we actually die to ourselves and say, Jesus, my life isn't for me, my life is for you. And because it's for you, it's also for others. We move our attention from ourselves onto Jesus. And as we move our attention onto Jesus, it inevitably shifts to other people as well. As we receive grace, we no longer need to live with how can I get what I want. In Christ, we have already received everything we need. So the question is, how can we live to bless others? God's purposes in blessing Abraham wasn't so that Abraham could have a nice, comfy, cushy, great life. It's so that the nations could be blessed through Abraham. First characteristic was bold faith. Second characteristic was it was all about Jesus. The third thing that I see in Abraham is a basic, fundamental obedience. Verse 4. So Abram went as the Lord told him. I love that. So Abram went as the Lord told him. What did Abram do? What God told him to do. Everybody say obedience. That is not a good word. I've been trying to teach it to my 2-year-old. Whew. It's good times. She was testing me this morning. I was asking her to leave Mom alone while Mom was getting dressed, and I said she needed to come and sit with me, and she looked at me like this. I said, you can't stand at the door while Mom's getting dressed. I want you to come sit down, come here. And she just sat down on the ground, and she was like, I sit. I was like, technically you're obeying. I did tell you that you can't stand, so now you're going to sit. I'm like, you're 2 and you're already finding the loopholes. Obedience is, on one hand, so simple, and on the other hand, so hard. Abram did in this case, starting in verse 4, he doesn't do it for very long, but he started off on a good foot. So Abram went as the Lord told him. Church, there will always be reasons that you will feel like I don't need to be obedient or I can't be obedient to the things of Jesus. For example, Abram was 75 years old. The dude was an old man. If you're getting into that, I love you. But 75 is pretty old to pack up your tents and travel across the desert. He was old. He could easily have said, God, I'm a bit old. I'm entering retirement. I want to work on my golf game or whatever they were playing at the time. But he doesn't. He went as the Lord told him. Church, you will always have what you perceive as legitimate reasons to not do what God is calling you to do. You will always be too busy, too transient, too poor, too rich, too whatever to say yes to Jesus. But if we're going to be people that are sent to multiply everything, then obedience is at the core of that. So Abram went. Is obedience a distinguishing characteristic of your walk with Jesus? When Jesus says go, do you go? When Jesus says give, do you give? When Jesus says stay, do you stay? I used to sing this old worship song to myself, where you go, I go, where you stay, I stay. And it was one of those songs that on one hand was so easy to sing, but I would sing it to myself to try to remind myself that my job wasn't to self-determine what it was good, wasn't to have a nice, cushy life. My job, very simply, as a Jesus follower, is obedience. If Jesus says go, you go. If Jesus says stay, you stay. Number 3 was Abram was obedient. The fourth characteristic I see here comes in verse 5. It says that Abram took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, everybody say all, the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired, and they set out for the land of Canaan. Translation, Abram's obedience was costly. It cost him something to do what God was calling him to do. So observation number 4 is that living the apostolic imperative is sacrificial. It is sacrificial. There's a theologian named F.F. Bruce, and he says this. He says, it is a glorious, everybody say glorious thing, but a costly thing to be the subject of God's election, to be his chosen instrument to carry his name to others. It is a glorious thing to be invited into the things of God. But church, it's a costly thing. It is a profoundly costly thing. In this case, it cost Abraham his family. He left his ancestors. He left his place of security. He left the familiar to enter the unfamiliar. He left the known to enter the unknown. He left the safe to enter the unsafe. Church, our attention is so easily shifted into how do we live nice, safe, comfortable, Western 21st century lives. And it is so difficult to do that in a way that is open-handed and sacrificial and missional. Our world loves to hold us down, to get us into situations where we can't make the sacrificial decision, or where it's difficult, or where it's costly. And we build our lives for stability and comfort. But people that live, everyone sent to multiply everything, build their lives not for stability and comfort and ease. They build their lives to maximize their impact for the kingdom. They ask the question, is this going to help further the purposes of God? And am I willing to give up comfort in order to do that? Not only cost Abram his family, it cost him, it says, all his possessions. He had to pack up everything of worth and try and move it. It would have been a costly endeavor. This reminds me of Jesus' invitation. The kingdom of heaven is like a merchant in search of fine pearls. When he found one priceless pearl, he went and sold everything he had and bought it. It may cost us our wealth. It may cost us our safety. These two things Abraham gave. But there was a third thing that he couldn't give. Verse 10, it says, there was a famine in the land. When Abraham started to suffer, his obedience started to waver. When Abraham started to suffer, his willingness to actually follow through and trust God and walk by faith began to waver. There was a famine in the land. And in that moment, the narrative of the story changes. Church, we need to adjust our thinking. Did God's blessing on Abraham, did God's promises on Abraham cease in that moment? Does God's promises to make him a great nation stop because there was a famine? No. Did Jesus' promises to build his church, does that have any condition associated with it? No. Does Jesus desire to use you to see the world around you brought to him? have any condition with it? No. No. We need to adjust our thinking that living sent means living easy, or living comfortable, or living without suffering. We dangerously assume that if we walk by faith, then everything will be easy. And when challenges come, we immediately begin to doubt that we're actually walking in obedience. Sometimes the challenges we're walking in are part of God teaching us to actually trust Him and continue to obey Him. F.F. Bruce actually, just after that quote I just read, says this: Abraham's selection involved not only a special service, but a special suffering. And Jesus was not exempt from suffering because God delighted in him. You see, the moment Abraham started to suffer, his obedience began to waver. And in this moment, we see Jesus. Abraham was a failure in this regard. He points us to Jesus, though, who, although suffered the pain of death, did not waver in his obedience. Jesus suffered and was faithful with absolutely no benefit to himself. But at a certain point, you and I so easily will begin to say, that's enough. This is too far, and this is too hard. You see, it's easy to look at a guy like Abraham and say, wow, look how great he is. Abraham's the bomb. He was the father of the nations. God promised him. But the truth is that he was super fallible. He encounters this famine, and he breaks God's promises, or he breaks his obedience to God's promises, and he runs away to Egypt. The moment he gets to Egypt, he then realizes that he's got a bit of a problem on his hands because he's got this really good-looking wife. And so he basically prostitutes her. He deceives Pharaoh. Do we see that the moment Abraham began to suffer, his obedience faltered, and it started to produce deception, lies, deceit, and pain to the people around him? But remember, I said God's promises never change. Look at what God does. You just got to bear with me for a second, because this is just brilliant. Verse 17, Abraham has walked in disobedience. He is broken. He's in a situation that he should never have been in. And it says that the Lord struck Pharaoh and his household with severe plagues because of Abram's wife. Verse 20, then Pharaoh gave his men orders about him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. When God sends the plagues against Pharaoh, it is an act of supreme and glorious grace. You may be going, why? Let's remember, what is God's ultimate intent with Abraham? God's ultimate intent with Abraham is that through Abraham, all nations would be blessed. Abraham is profoundly disobedient. But even though Abraham is profoundly disobedient, God's desire to bring blessing remains. God's faithfulness remains even though Abraham is unfaithful. Church, in this moment, this little narrative, this little story about how God redeems Abraham out of a situation that he got himself into is a picture of the gospel. Although Abraham was a sinner, God's grace abounds and his promises remain. Church, out of a totally broken, fallible vessel, God redeems his promise of salvation. Church, this is the best possible news when we talk about being everyone sent to multiply everything. It means that for you and I, as ambassadors and carriers of grace, it is not contingent on our perfection, and our goodness and our works and our skill. No, it's all about Jesus' grace and his goodness and his promises. You can be imperfect. You can be fallible. In fact, you are imperfect and you are fallible. But Jesus' grace is big enough and glorious enough to still use you for his purposes. God's purposes in your life are not dependent on your failure. His grace abounds. Church, that is the gospel. That although we are sinners, God's grace abounds and his promises remain. There's one final piece. God promised Abraham that he was going to be a blessing to the nations. That promise was not fulfilled in Abraham. That promise was fulfilled in Jesus. It would be a couple thousand years later that Jesus would come, a descendant of Abraham, to fulfill that promise. And when Jesus arrives, it is in a totally broken and messed up situation. But he comes to redeem and bring hope. But here's the best news. When Jesus fulfills that promise, that through Abraham, all nations would be blessed, you and I are invited to continue living that promise. God's desire to bless the nations through people didn't end at Jesus. It actually began. God's desire to bless the nations that he promised in Abraham was fulfilled in Jesus and executed in you and I. We are now carriers of that promise. The promise that God gave to Abraham now belongs to you. You receive the blessings, new life in Jesus, as well as the commandment to go and be a blessing. Church, we are called to be a blessing to the world around us, not because we are great, but because Jesus is great. And that is not a burden that we lay on you. That is an invitation that God extends to you. The invitation to multiplication, the invitation to evangelism, the invitation to a life of mission is not an invitation to a life of burden. It is an invitation to a life of joy, because in that moment we are living the purposes of God. And this is why the first sermon, one of the first sermons that Peter preaches after Jesus ascends, he says this: "And you, church, are heirs of the prophets and the covenant God made with your fathers." You receive the promise today. You receive the call to both be made alive in Jesus, not because of what you have done, but because of what he has done, and to go forth and be a blessing to the world around you. Why don't we bow our heads and pray? There's a number of challenges